Well, first of all, let me say thank you. My talk is going to be a little bit different. I'm a lawyer. I'm a managing counsel at Merck. So I'm not going to give you the science. I'm going to give you my perspective on the topics that we've been talking about today, namely health literacy. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a very sort of enlightening day listening to the presenters, and I've learned a lot. So I think the first slide tells it all from a lawyer's perspective, because I'm the only one who's put up a disclaimer slide. So it's important that the things I'm going to say are my opinions, not those of my employers. And I would recommend to those of you who have in-house lawyers to talk to them about a disclaimer slide. So when Lori asked me to come to talk to you guys, one of the things she said was that there's this sentiment out there that lawyers are a block to health literacy. And I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. Certainly it isn't the case at Merck. But it is important, I think, for you all to understand sort of how lawyers think and how that might be perceived as a block when you're talking to them about health literacy. So some of you may or may not be familiar with the term legalese, which does seem to be somewhat in conflict with the notion of health literacy. It's an English term that was first used in 1914, and it's a term that's used to describe legal writing. And interestingly, it's legal writing that's designed to be difficult for common people to read and understand, somewhat in conflict with health literacy principles. So from a lawyer's perspective, words matter. And I heard somebody else earlier today say that, and it's very true when I think about it from my perspective. So a lawyer has to ensure that what is said will be found to mean precisely what is intended upon later scrutiny. So we go in looking at, okay, what is going to go wrong, and how can we ensure that the words that are used are going to cover it. And so we have to be aware not only what the natural meaning of words are, but we also have to take into consideration what courts have determined those words may mean. So what does that mean in terms of health literacy? Someone also said earlier today, keep it simple. Well, whenever you get lawyers involved, they're going to want to add words, because they're going to want to make sure that they've covered everything. And so sometimes it's difficult when you think about health literacy and prescription drug labeling. So let's talk about prescription drug labeling. True or false? The primary purpose of prescription drug labeling is to give patients the information they need to take medicines properly. Who thinks that's true? Right, false. Although patients may obtain useful information from prescription drug labeling, its primary purpose is to give healthcare professionals the information they need to prescribe the drugs appropriately. And I think that's a very important thing that we have to keep in mind, right? Fundamentally, prescription drug labeling is designed first and foremost for the healthcare professionals who are making the prescribing decisions.
Can we have a definition here of label?
Sure. So I'm talking here specifically about the product labeling. So the product for the drug, right? So it can be the physician prescribing information, and then we'll turn to the patient labeling as well. And we can also talk about promotional labeling, which would encompass all the things that pharmaceutical manufacturers put out there in relationship to their product, okay? So what are the requirements for prescription drug labeling? They have to give a summary for the safe and effective use of the drug. They have to be informative and accurate, not promotional, not false, not misleading. You can't have any implied claims or suggestions for use that's not supported by evidence. And wherever possible, it has to be derived from human data. And importantly, it's approved by the FDA. That's very important from my perspective. There are 3 types of patient labeling currently. There's patient package inserts, also sometimes referred as PPIs. There are instructions for use, and there's medication guides. All of these, importantly, are approved by FDA. So again, words matter, and from my perspective, I'm going to be looking to the approved labeling when we decide what we can talk about. So medication guides are required in certain instances. If the product has patient serious adverse events connected to it, it's going to be required. They want to make sure that risks are identified for patients so that they can be informed. And finally, it'll provide adherence information. So concepts of health literacy are encompassed within the regulations. In medication guides, they're supposed to be written in non-technical, understandable language, not promotional, scientifically accurate, based on, and not in conflict with the professional labeling for the product. That's very important. The physician's prescribing information, okay? It doesn't have to be identical, but it has to be based on and not in conflict with. So, let's talk about drug promotional materials. So drug promotional materials, first and foremost, must be consistent with the approved product labeling. So if it's physician promotional labeling, it's got to be consistent with your physician prescribing information. If it's patient consumer-directed promotional labeling, it's going to have to be consistent with your patient labeling. So as a regulatory lawyer, what I look at when materials come through to the Promotional Review Committee, which we have at Merck, I look at what our promotional materials say, and then I look at what our product labeling says. Again, I look at the physician prescribing information, and I look at the patient product information. And words matter. So I'm going to look for consistency. In fact, I'm going to look for the language to be identical. So from a health literacy standpoint, if we don't incorporate health literacy concepts in from the start, it's going to be very difficult as the regulatory lawyer to get comfortable with approving it, because my question is going to be, why are we changing the words? FDA has approved this label. They have determined that it's not misleading. Why are we changing the words? And I'm not going to let you change the words. So it's important that we think about health literacy concepts from the start. So let's talk about product liability, because this is another concept that lawyers have to think about, right? What happens if a patient has an adverse event and they want to bring a lawsuit against the pharmaceutical company or the prescriber? So there's a concept in the law known as the learned intermediary rule. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay. So in most jurisdictions, most states, there's a defense to failure to warn claims, and it's known as the learned intermediary doctrine. Under this doctrine, a pharmaceutical manufacturer is relieved of its duty to warn the consumer, the patient, if the manufacturer supplying the drug provides information to the physician with information about the drug's dangerous propensities. So what does that mean for folks who are prescribing the medicines? That means if the pharmaceutical company has warned about something in their physician prescribing information, and the patient has that event, but the physician has failed to get informed consent from the patient, it is the physician who has liability. It's not the pharmaceutical company. So how does that sort of impact when we think about health literacy? It's important to sort of think about how our prescription drug process is set up, right? Pharmaceutical companies are the ones who put the drugs out there, but they are not the ones who make the prescribing decisions. Those are the healthcare professionals. So this doctrine is meant to reflect that fact, right? The rationale for the doctrine is that prescription drugs are likely to be complex medicines, esoteric in formula and varied in effect. The entire system of drug distribution in America is set up so as to place the responsibility of distribution and use upon professional people, pharmacists, and physicians. The laws and regulations prevent prescription-type drugs from being purchased by individuals without the advice, guidance, and consent of licensed physicians and pharmacists. These professionals are in the best position to evaluate the warnings put out by the drug industry. As a medical expert, the prescribing physician can take into account the propensities of the drug as well as the susceptibilities of the patient, and I would argue the health literacy of the patient. His is the task of weighing the benefits of any medication against its potential dangers. That is the law in most jurisdictions. New Jersey has an exception to that rule, and that is known as the direct-to-consumer advertising exception. In New Jersey, if pharmaceutical companies go directly to consumers, then they can also be held liable if there's a failure to warn claim. However, even in New Jersey, if your promotional materials disclose the risks that are included in your patient labeling, so if they comply with the language in your patient product labeling, the manufacturer is discharged from liability. So one could argue that the current state of product liability law is a disincentive to health literacy from a pharmaceutical company perspective. I don't think that's actually true. I think it's still incumbent upon pharmaceutical companies to make sure patients understand the risks and benefits of the product. But certainly, the learned intermediary doctrine places the onus on the prescribing physician because it is viewed that the prescribing physician is in the best place to have the discussion with the patient and to know their particular circumstances. So, what are the key takeaways, at least from my perspective? I think health literacy should and must be considered in product labeling. There are legal considerations that present challenges, but they're certainly not insurmountable, at least from my perspective. Timing is important. It needs to be considered from the start. And I should say that's not to say that if in the course of post-marketing there is a safety issue that is identified that's not reflected in the labeling, labels get updated. That is when they get updated, right? And so you can take health literacy into context at that point in time too. But finally, if you're looking at a product that's been on the market for a long time and hasn't had any label changes, you need to determine where the best opportunities to incorporate health literacy are. Certainly in the disease state, there's no legal issues there with sort of relooking at your disease materials. And formatting. I've heard a lot about sort of different things you can do with formatting. Those don't present legal challenges either. My final thought is we all need to work together. So if you guys have lawyers in your organizations and they're not at the table with you, you should bring them to the table. Because I think that when the lawyers understand what you're trying to accomplish, they will help you find a solution. Thank you.